the south shore of Lake Erie, this is Great Lakes True Crime. This is Episode 2, The Kirtland Cult Killings. On January 3rd and 4th, 1990, the remains of Dennis Avery, his wife Cheryl, and their daughters, 15-year-old Trina, 13-year-old Rebecca, and 7-year-old Karen, were dug up from their family barn at 8671 Chardon Road in Kirtland, Ohio. This was only the beginning of a widely discussed saga that would come to be known as the Kirtland Cult Killings, the worst mass murder in the history of Lake County, Ohio. Kirtland is a quiet, suburban town of about 7,000 east of Cleveland in neighboring Lake County. It is well known as the early headquarters of the Latter-day Saints movement, as Joseph Smith moved the church there in 1831, shortly after its organization. Kirtland is home to the Mormon Temple, and today Kirtland remains a place of importance to those of all Latter-day Saint denominations. Dan Dunlap was a lieutenant for the Lake County Sheriff's Office at the time of the murders. Now the sheriff for Lake County, he was on patrol the day Kirtland Police Chief Dennis Yarborough requested assistance from the Sheriff's Office and the Lake County Crime Lab in processing the crime scene on Chardon Road. The place was damp, cold, dark, and full of trash and rubble, so there was a lot of clearing going on, said Dunlap. They found the bodies beneath layers of soil, rocks, and garbage in the rear portion of the barn's lower level, he added. Said Deputy Ron Walters, quote, "The chief deputy called the night before and told me to be at the barn in Kirtland by 7 in the morning because the police there thought they'd found a mass grave. One of the things I remember is dealing with all the water running off into the area where we were digging." Close quote. The crime scene had an awful smell and contained a number of personal items belonging to the Averys, including drawings and notebooks that had belonged to Trina, Rebecca, and Karen. It was beyond horrific. Karen Cowell, who was with the county prosecutor's office at the time and still works there today, later recalled, "They were some pretty seasoned law enforcement officers that day, and I remember the effect it had on them when it was clear the children had been murdered too." One by one, the Averys had been bound, gagged, and shot dead in cold blood almost 9 months earlier. Police would later learn that this was the work of Jeffrey Lundgren. Born in 1950 in Independence, Missouri, Lundgren was 39 years old at the time of the murders. Lundgren was raised in the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or RLDS for short. While attending college, Lundgren met and married his wife Alice. Unsuccessful in school, Lundgren joined the Navy and served in the Vietnam War in the early 1970s. After his honorable discharge in 1974, he unsuccessfully held a series of hospital maintenance and other jobs in Missouri. In the summer of 1984, Lundgren and his family moved from Missouri to Kirtland so that Lundgren could serve as a guide at the Mormon Temple, a job that paid nothing but did include family lodging. Lundgren initially attracted favorable attention in his Sunday school classes and as a guide. He generally fit within the traditions of the RLDS faith in that he described visions, direct spiritual experiences, and God speaking directly to prophets. Over the next 3 years, Lundgren continued to serve as a temple guide and taught classes on the Bible and the Book of Mormon. Despite the church's direction to turn over all money received from temple visitors to the church, Lundgren solicited and kept contributions received from visitors. Overall temple contributions dropped dramatically, and the temple bookstore also suffered financial shortfalls. The church eventually removed Lundgren as a religion teacher and, in October 1987, fired him as a temple guide and evicted him from his quarters adjacent to the temple. From 1985 on, Lundgren attracted a substantial following in his classes because of his knowledge of religious texts. Eventually, Kevin Curry and Sharon Bluntschy moved in with the Lundgrens, as did Richard Brand, Daniel Kraft, and Gregory Winship. Debbie Oliveras joined the group in 1988. Those living with Lundgren often called him Dad and turned over their paychecks and other money earned for common group expenses. Two couples, Ron and Susan Luff, and Dennis and Tanya Patrick, also contributed money but did not live with the Lundgrens. In the spring of 1987, the Avery family moved from Missouri to follow Lundgren's teachings. The Avery family included Dennis, age 49, Cheryl, age 46, and their daughters Trina, age 15, Rebecca, age 13, and Karen, age 7. After Lundgren's eviction, he and his family and followers moved to a rented farmhouse. There, Lundgren continued his classes, stressing the importance of the Kirtland Temple. According to Lundgren, his followers had to recapture the temple, an earthquake would elevate it, and Christ would return and establish Zion. Lundgren also spoke of his conversations with God and his visions. He discussed the Book of Revelations and the Book of Mormon, and referred to, quote, pruning the vineyard, and the need to kill 10 followers before Zion could be created. Eventually, the men in the group undertook paramilitary training to prepare for a temple assault. Lundgren picked May 3, 1988, his birthday, as the day to recapture the temple, but later decided it was not yet time. Although they were devout followers, the Averys were on the fringe of the group and were invited to only a few of Lundgren's prayer meetings. By October 1988, the RLDS Church had excommunicated Lundgren. In early 1989, Lundgren was stressing the need for his followers to go on a wilderness trip before Zion would be possible. By that time, both Kevin Curry and another follower, Shar Olson, had left the group, but Catherine and Larry Johnson had joined. In April 1989, at Lundgren's direction, the group began preparing for the wilderness trip. Those who worked left their jobs and bought some provisions. Lundgren encouraged any of the group members to use up their available credit cards. All the group members, including the Averys, gathered their worldly possessions. Around April 12th, 2 or 3 of the followers secretly began digging a 6 by 7 foot pit in the dirt floor of Lundgren's barn. Lundgren told Cheryl Avery to write and tell her family that they were going to Wyoming. Then Lundgren invited the Averys to dinner. Although the Averys were among his staunchest followers and had given thousands of dollars, Lundgren had determined that Dennis Avery, in particular, was threatening his hold over the other cult members and thus had to be sacrificed. Lundgren used his twisted interpretation of Scripture and powers of persuasion to convince the other cult members to help with this sacrifice. On April 17, 1989, Dennis, Cheryl, and their 3 daughters ate dinner at Lundgren's farmhouse. After dinner, Lundgren went out to the barn with his son Damon and 4 followers, Brand, Kraft, Wintrip, and Ron Luff. The Averys stayed in the house with the women and children. At Lundgren's direction, Luff individually led each Avery family member out to the barn, where each was bound and gagged by the men. After the men placed each Avery family member into the pit, Lundgren shot each person 2 or 3 times with a .45 caliber pistol. The men then filled the pit with dirt and stones. Afterwards, Lundgren and the others went back to the farmhouse and held a prayer meeting. Now, before the slayings, Lundgren ensured that no one would look for the Averys by directing Cheryl Avery to write to relatives and inform them that the family was moving to Wyoming and would provide contact information when they got settled. The next day, April 18th, police officers and FBI agents visited the Lundgren farm to investigate reports about the planned temple assault. Everyone interviewed said they were at the farm without being coerced and denied knowing anything about plans to assault the temple. The FBI left without arresting anyone and had no idea of the murders that took place there only hours earlier. Lundgren and his followers drove away on their wilderness trip. Lundgren selected mountain campsites near Davis, West Virginia, and the group lived in tents there through October 1989. Some of the followers took jobs, and the men continued their military exercises. While in West Virginia, Lundgren chose Tanya Patrick as his second wife. That arrangement didn't work out too well, so Lundgren then picked Katherine Johnson as his second wife. That choice didn't sit well with Larry Johnson, Katherine's husband, and added to a growing group dissension. By October 1989, Lundgren, his family, and about 10 of his followers moved to Missouri. However, more dissension occurred, and by the end of December 1989, Larry Johnson had contacted ATF agents in Kansas City, Missouri, and told them about the murders of the Averys. He provided a hand-drawn map of the barn and burial pit. By the way, here's a note to cult leaders. Choosing a second wife is not only illegal, but risky business at best. Okay, that was a joke. As dusk gave way to darkness on January 3rd, 1990, Kirtland Police Chief Dennis Yarborough and Patrolman Ron Andelsek stood aside the burial pit as members of Kirtland's police and fire departments carefully pulled soil, rocks, and debris away from the remains of Dennis Avery. The working group inside the barn on that grim January 1990 day also included the Lake County Crime Lab, Painesville-based FBI agent Bob Alvord, and 3 ATF agents. With representatives from an ever-growing number of local and national media outlets gathering outside the barn, the general attitude inside was purposeful, according to Dan Dunlap. It was pretty dispassionate, Dunlap said. I didn't hear any anger being expressed. I heard a lot about working together and preserving the evidence. He added, I'd been in law enforcement about 19 years at that point, been at a lot of death scenes, and learned that at some point the bodies become evidence. Walters said he adopted a similar attitude as the Averys were disinterred. It bothered me that night when I got home and took off my clothes in the garage so I wouldn't carry that smell into the house, he said. Then you look at your kids, and you can't help but think of those kids who were killed, he added. But I don't dwell on that. I dwell on catching the bad guy. Walters threw away the clothes he was wearing inside the barn. Dunlap burned the old snowmobile suit he chose to wear. The smell of death hung in the air, said Stephen LaTourette, who at the time was the Lake County prosecutor. LaTourette would later serve 18 years in the U.S. House of Representatives before passing away in 2016 at the age of 62. Police uncovered the other Avery family members' bodies the next day, January 4th. The coroner found silver duct tape wrapped around the victims' heads, hands, and feet. The origin of 2 damaged bullets found at the scene was unknown. Police discovered that a .45 caliber semi-automatic weapon belonging to Lundgren had fired all of the other bullets they recovered. Lundgren bought the weapon in 1987 and sold it in West Virginia in October 1989. On January 7, 1990, federal authorities arrested Lundgren in California, where he had recently moved to. Chief Yarborough, a fitness fanatic, died in 1998 while jogging. Some suspect that he never quite shook the pain he internalized from the Avery killings. Jeffrey Lundgren was executed by lethal injection on October 24, 2006, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, Ohio. Among the witnesses to the execution was Donald Bailey, Cheryl Avery's younger brother. In an act of defiance, he walked up close to the death chamber's glass window to ensure that Lundgren knew he was there. He got what he deserved, said Bailey in a written statement. My only regret is that he has but one life to give. After the execution, prison officials said Lundgren had been so certain that he would win a delay that he napped much of the morning. However, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to accept his last appeal a little more than an hour before the scheduled execution. Governor Bob Taft denied Lundgren's request for clemency. So the self-proclaimed prophet who surrounded himself with loyal cult followers died with no family members or friends among the witnesses. With no one claiming his body, Lundgren was buried in a simple ceremony in a prison grave in Chillicothe, Ohio. After being discovered, the Avery family was buried in the rolling hills of Missouri. A Missouri church community raised thousands of dollars to pay for the burial and to launch a children's charity so that the memory of Trina, Rebecca, and Karen Avery would not end in a muddy pit in Kirtland, Ohio. Great Lakes True Crime is written, produced, and hosted by me, Stephen Doyle. Thanks for listening, Buys.